Hello and welcome back to another episode of Insight with me, Thomas Stockting, here at TVC22 in Clarence, Rockland. Today we're going to be looking into a topic that really came into the news after an unfortunate event, I think to say the least, occurred in our region, which was the death of a kangaroo named Willow after it had escaped from a local zoo named Papanak. So we're here today to really talk about the idea and the ethical viability of zoos and roadside zoos such as Papanak going forward. Are they a thing of the past? Are they something that still holds a place in the future? Does it need to be for entertainment or maybe for conservation purposes? To speak to us a little bit on this topic, we have a guest from Humane Canada, the largest animal welfare organisation in Canada, who promote the welfare and human treatment of animals across the country. So Natalie, Hanson, if I could get you to join me on here. Thank you very much for being with me today. How are you?
Hi, Thomas. I'm really well. Thank you so much for having me. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much. As I said, thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak to us today. I think my first question is going to be a little bit of a broader one, but I think it will give us a great place to start and kick off the conversation, which is really what Humane Canada, what your general stance around zoos is. Do you think they are something that's outdated, something of the past? Do you think they can be used properly? What's the general view from your organisation?
Perfect. Yeah. Well, first of all, honestly, thank you so much for inviting us here. As you said it before, we are the National Animal Welfare Organization in Canada. And when it comes to zoos or wildlife enclosures, we really only support those which adhere to the principle that the needs and welfare of the animals are met first and foremost, leaving profit after. So we don't want to see organizations that are compromised by economic factors, which is unfortunately the circumstance sometimes, or a lot of times with roadside zoos. It is hard sometimes for these places to have the funding and the capacity to build appropriate enclosures to meet the physical, the social, and the emotional needs of the animals that they keep.
Yeah, that's really interesting, as you say, that sort of idea of profit first or therefore lack of it. Do you think as well a dip in popularity then? Because I mean, it's fair to say that roadside zoos in particular have lost a lot of mainstream customers over the last few decades as our own views as to seeing animals in their natural environment has increased. So do you think this almost decrease in popularity and therefore decrease in revenue could be contributing to more negative lifestyles for the animals in captivity?
I would say that first and foremost, we don't have a statistic to know exactly what the general visitors, let's say, rate is for roadside zoos or for bigger zoos or for other places that keep animals in captivity for entertainment purposes. But I would dare to say that, yes, it has decreased significantly. I think a lot of it has to do with the power of social media and the fact that people are nowadays realizing that this is not really okay for the welfare of the animals. And not just that, but other things like certain documentaries that have come out, like Blackfish, let's say, have really opened up people's eyes to what is the price I'm paying for that ticket entry to go and have fun with my family and my children, but what is the price that the animals are paying? And in regards to your other question as well, I definitely think, and we would like to see roadside zoos as a thing of the past for sure. And yeah, when the pandemic started, for instance, last year, some of these enclosures and some of these businesses did come out publicly and say that they were struggling to meet their financial needs to support their animals. So there is no doubt that the decline in visitors could definitely, unfortunately, negatively affect the welfare of the animals that they keep.
And I know we mentioned roadside zoos there because Papanak is one. We know we have a lot of other different kinds of zoos as well as, I'm going to say, conservation areas across the country. I mean, Little Ray's Reptiles, which is one that's not too far away from here, is one that does focus on conservation. So when we talk about zoos in general, is there a difference in between the way, because I know Little Ray's, they were having to do, as you mentioned earlier about the idea of people struggling. They were massively struggling to meet their bills. They were massively massively struggling to ensure the enclosures were kept at the right levels in terms of humidity, in terms of heat, in terms of cold for the variety of different animals they had. So do you think there's even place then for these conservation authorities to look after animals like that to still exist, or do you think they all need to be a thing of the past?
Yeah, well, I think, in a utopic world, and this is something that we actually consulted with ZooCheck, which is an organization that advocates on behalf of animals that are kept in zoos. And we were talking about how the idea of moving zoos or roadside zoos from their current format to a sanctuary, while it sounds beautiful, it's very utopic because being realistic, there is no government funding to support enclosures of that kind, like sanctuaries. Moreover, if we look at Canada and we look at our climate, do we really have the capacity to provide a sanctuary that really resembles the natural habitat of, let's say, a lion or a chimpanzee? I don't think so. So in the perfect world, they wouldn't exist. Zoos wouldn't exist. Roadside zoos wouldn't exist. And again, I just want to clarify that Humane Canada is not in agreement with those organizations and those enclosures and those facilities that cannot comply with the behavioral, emotional, and physical needs of the animals.
Absolutely, and when you mention there, that is the big thing, right? It's about what the facility can offer the animal, and if it cannot offer it sufficiently, then your view, the organisation's view, is that it should not exist. So does this come down to the fault of the owners not stepping up and doing what was right for the animal, or does it come down to, and I know we can't touch on it too specifically, but does it come down to the regulations and the way it's being enforced across the provinces? I know Ontario gets a lot of beef, to use the term, about the way that they could be maybe a little bit hands off with the way in which restrictions and regulations are actually enforced.
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's definitely a combination of both. But it comes down to the regulations. And as you've said, in Ontario, we don't really have regulations that oversee zoos or roadside zoos. If you've looked at other provinces, and again, this is a conversation that we had with our colleagues at ZooCheck, provinces like British Columbia or New Brunswick, just to name a few, they have acted and they have taken action when there have been incidents involving exotic animals or wild animals. You may recall a couple of years ago in New Brunswick, there was an incident where a ball python escaped its enclosure and it killed 2 children while they were sleeping. Well, New Brunswick took action right away. It hasn't happened in Ontario, unfortunately. And our colleagues at ZooCheck told us that they have been lobbying for changes, and it just hasn't happened. There just hasn't been an interest from the provincial government to enact any regulations. In regards to the owners of these places, they also shared with us, ZooCheck, that in Alberta, after they have tried to lobby for many, many years, they finally got some regulations to pass. And once they passed, half of the zoo owners didn't renew their licenses. So what does that tell us? Does that tell us that they're not renewing their licenses because they were not complying with what the new regulations stipulated? I would dare to say so.
You make a very interesting point to see if that change in regulation could force owners into a kind of light that they may not want to be seen in. To move away a little bit from the rhetoric of closing down and moving away from roadside zoos, as you say, in a utopic world, they would be a thing of the past and we wouldn't have them, but they still exist today. So in terms of before we can get to the point the government's changing their regulations, which again would be another great step, but we're not seeing it just yet. What could they say the owners of Papanak Zoo do differently? We know they had the lion named Zeus, who escaped a few years ago and had to be put down. Willow the kangaroo, which sparked this conversation, escaped and was seen by witnesses hurt on the side of the road, and in the end the zoo just posted something saying that the kangaroo, the Willow died. Like, we don't know, was she euthanized? Did she succumb to her wounds? I want to take this moment as well to say that we have reached out multiple times to Papanak Zoo to get a comment, to just try and understand their side of what occurred in this situation, but they have not yet given us a comment, with the owner apparently being away. So we will keep pushing that. But to come back to this, Natalia, what could these zoos be doing differently to stop these kind of escapes and to try and better the lifestyle of the animals that they do have in captivity?
Yeah, for sure. And as you've said, Thomas, it is impossible to say really what exact circumstances were surrounding Willow's death. We know that she escaped her enclosure. There were photos. There was evidence of people who saw her along the highway. And then she returned to the zoo. But we don't know what happened after. As you said, was she euthanized, come to her wounds? I guess we'll never know. And what we know is that unlike any other jurisdictions, there is no comprehensive, meaningful legislation for zoos in Ontario, like we've discussed. And basically, it goes back to the point that I was making earlier. What they could do, the existing roadside zoos, to better improve the life of animals that they already have, is putting them first. So right now, the model seems the public, staff, animals. What if we fled over and it was animals, staff, public? The animals should always come first. So looking at where is this animal originally from? How can they improve the housing arrangements and their living conditions to kind of closely resemble those of their natural habitat? That would be a first and foremost. Other things is, for instance, if there are any facilities that use their animals for entertainment purposes. So for instance, I'm making something up, but there's a lion feeding show at 2 p.m. But what if the lion is not emotionally feeling up to it? And that comes down to that topic of animals as sentient beings. They can be tired just as we are. They can be just not feeling up for it, just like we are, having a bad day. So are they keeping the animals' well-being emotionally and physically first? Or they have to comply, the public waiting, who paid for the ticket at the door to see the lion feeding show at 2 p.m.?
So in terms of like what we've got in place at the moment, say let's use another, I'm going to call it zoo, but another park in Canada, not too far from here, like Park Omega. Does that have a better setup with the bigger, more wide space open enclosures than say something like a roadside zoo that keeps animals often in smaller conditions, smaller cages and harsher conditions?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can't speak for Park Omega because we haven't had any relationship with them. But if you were to compare both of them and you compare an enclosure where the animals are kept in a cage that probably does not resemble their natural habitat, and a place like Park Omega where they're out in the open and in the wild, then of course that sounds like a better option for the animal. Absolutely.
And when we mentioned utopias earlier about the animals getting back into like their kind of having something that resembles more their natural habitat, well, if we look at the next steps moving forward from here with zoos, a lot of these animals, as we know with, I mentioned little rays earlier, it's the last place for them to go. They're often animals that were maybe seized by the government because someone brought them in illegally, and they're being looked after because the next step is euthanization. So what's the realistic next step for zoos here? Say if these zoos don't meet the regulations, if they close down, say for example, we go along the lines of what you were saying about Alberta, changing the regulations, and not a lot of zoos are not renewing their licenses. What happens to all the animals that might still have years to live because they've been in captivity for so long, they can't go back into the wild, can they?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and you make a good point because I feel like the public sometimes they have the animals' interest in mind, and it's easy for them to say, send them back, bring them back, but probably they don't understand that the animals have been in a way domesticated, and they may not be able to thrive in their natural habitat anymore, whether that be Africa, Asia, or whatever they may have originally way back when come from. So in that case, it kind of ties in a little bit to the message that we or humane societies, SPCAs, animal shelters give out of spaying and neutering dogs and cats. What do we try to do when we spay and neuter dogs and cats? To end the overpopulation of animals. So in this case, it would be something similar. So we do not support the continuous captivity and continuous breeding of captive animals. So in a case of, let's say, I'm just making it up, an iguana that was kept as a pet, and then the owners couldn't keep it anymore, and the iguana ends up in a wild center. Well, let the iguana live the rest of its life, but let's not get into a habit of wow, let's breed this iguana so we can continue our education purposes and bring in some money and bring in some people. That's what we're trying to prevent. So let's take care of the animal for as long as it lives, but let's end it there.
So provide them with a comfortable, adequate and appropriate space to live out the rest of their days. So is that ideally what Humane Canada want to get at? Like, what's the, again, we mentioned utopia. Is that where we'd like to get to, where all of these places across the country that have animals in captivity, these animals are looked after, cared for in appropriate conditions to live out the rest of their normal lives, and then that be it, that be the bottom line, we not go any further? Is that like the ideal world for you?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, unless there was some science-based evidence of why it's important to continue breeding that particular species, then maybe we could look into what are the benefits of continuing to breed that animal, which, sometimes is the case, right? Maybe there's a species that is in danger of extinction. So there just has to be a lot of scientific evidence behind it for sure. Otherwise, again, if it's just for profit, we don't see the point.
And clearly some changes do need to be made, and reverting back at the end of this conversation to what started it all, Papanak Zoo here locally. What would you recommend people in the local area who might be watching this and feeling a little bit motivated to do something, whether it's to lobby that they increase the conditions that the animal's living in, or push to try and get the zoo closed, or whatever it may be, or trying to lobby the government for further regulation? What would you recommend that people watching and who are feeling a little bit motivated by this conversation go and do next?
Yeah, that's a great question, Thomas, because we always tell people as an organization, we always encourage people to get politically active. And I feel like people sometimes are daunted by that term of feeling, oh, but I'm not political. I don't know anything about politics. I don't have power. I don't know anybody in politics. I don't have influence. But that's not the case. It can be as simple as finding out who your MP is and reaching out to that person. And we've heard this from MPs themselves, that they tell us what makes the most impact for them is when people reach out to them directly. So sometimes we as an organization have launched letter writing campaigns for certain things. Let's say ban chuck wagon races. That works, of course. Give them a phone call to their office and say, hi, my name is so-and-so, I live in your riding, and I care about animals, specifically about this issue. Now, the thing is that they may not get a response right away. Their MP may not call them right away and say, no problem, Mary, I'll get on it right away. I'm going to close zoos tomorrow. That's not how it happens, unfortunately. But that's when we can't give up and we have to continue. Things like even talking to your people, to your neighbors, your family, your friends, and discouraging them from continuing to support these places. I feel like sometimes people don't have bad intentions. They probably just don't know better. Certainly happened to me on a personal level, where sometimes I have adjusted my own ways of living to be more kind to animals because I know better now. So if perhaps they bring up the fact of Willow's recent death and say to their network, hey, listen, maybe don't take your kids this weekend to a roadside zoo like you were planning, because this just happened, and think of the welfare of the animals. That's helping. Sharing stories. Let's remember the power of social media. So when something like this happens, share, talk about it, enlighten your network, and tell them why it's important to always think of the animals first. Not profit, but always the animals.
And Natalia, just to throw this one out to you at the very end, is there any way that you and the organisation could possibly see a world in the future where having zoos being acceptable?
That is a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, the model will really have to be readjusted to put animals first and profit last. And maybe at that point, it can be discussed. But we're not completely against the fact that zoos exist in Canada. We know of some organizations that really are working towards the welfare of each animal and each species, and have rescued animals, for instance, exotic animals that were kept as pets. But it's really those organizations that are putting the welfare of the animals first.
Absolutely. Well, Natalia, thank you so much for taking your time to speak to us today. That was Natalia Hanson from the Humane Canada organisation here looking after the welfare of animals to discuss the ethical viability of zoos in our country going forward. So thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in for this episode. And Natalia, once again, thank you very much for joining me. See you next time.
Thank you so much for having us. Bye-bye.